Richard Mercer destroyed a man outside his building. The homeless figure curled against the glass was nothing to him, less than nothing, a stain on his empire's gleaming facade. He called security with the casual cruelty of someone who had never known consequence. The morning sun reflected off towers of steel and ambition, while Arthur Hale was dragged away from the only warmth he'd found in weeks. What Mercer didn't know, what he couldn't see beneath the layers of grime and abandonment, was that this broken man owned everything. The building, the company, the very air Mercer breathed with such entitled confidence. In downtown Dallas, a billionaire humiliated a homeless man, and by sunset, his entire world would belong to the victim he'd just destroyed. Subscribe now, because some humiliations echo forever. The morning arrived in downtown Dallas with the cruel precision of a blade finding flesh, sunlight slicing between skyscrapers and casting long shadows across streets still damp from the previous night's rain. Richard Mercer stepped from his Blacktown car at exactly 7:45, as he did every weekday morning, his Italian leather shoes touching pavement worth more per square foot than most people earned in a month. The air held that particular urban coldness that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the thousands of people moving through space without truly seeing each other, each wrapped in their own capsule of purpose and destination. The Mercer Tower rose 37 stories above the street, a monument of steel and reflective glass that caught the dawn light and threw it back at the city like a challenge. Like a declaration that some men built themselves so high that ordinary human concerns could no longer reach them. Richard paused on the sidewalk, adjusting his silk tie in the mirrored surface of the lobby windows, admiring the sharp lines of his own face, the distinguished grey at his temples that spoke of wisdom rather than age. The expression of controlled power that he'd perfected over decades of crushing competitors and reshaping entire industries to fit his vision of how the world should function. That was when he noticed the homeless man curled against the base of his building, tucked into the small alcove where the loading dock met the main entrance, wrapped in layers of filthy fabric that might once have been a coat, but now looked like something excavated from a landfill. The figure was barely visible in the shadows, just a huddled mass of human wreckage that had somehow survived the night and now occupied space that belonged to Richard's carefully constructed reality. The sight triggered an immediate surge of disgust, not the kind that comes from genuine moral concern, but the aesthetic revulsion of someone encountering dirt in a space meant to be pristine, a flaw in the perfect image he presented to the city each morning. Richard's jaw tightened as he took in the details. The shopping cart nearby filled with plastic bags and mysterious bundles, the cardboard sign propped against the wall with words he didn't bother reading, the smell that reached him even from 15 feet away, that particular stench of unwashed human desperation that no amount of wealth could completely insulate him from. His morning routine, his moment of triumph as he entered his domain, had been contaminated by this reminder that the world contained failure, that not everyone ascended to the heights he'd claimed, that poverty and homelessness still existed in the shadows of his success. Arthur Hale had been awake for hours, watching the city emerge from darkness through eyes that had learned to see things other people missed, cataloguing the patterns of human behavior that revealed true character more accurately than any resume or corporate biography. He'd positioned himself at this exact spot deliberately, had spent the previous 3 weeks mapping the CEO's morning arrival, understanding the route from car to lobby, identifying the moment when Richard Mercer was most vulnerable to observation. The cold concrete beneath him had long since stopped registering as discomfort. After months of sleeping in doorways, under bridges, in the forgotten corners of the city his father had helped build, Arthur's body had adapted to deprivation in ways that would have broken a softer man. His beard was thick and unkempt, grey and brown tangled together, hiding a face that once graced magazine covers and boardroom portraits before he'd chosen this path of deliberate descent. The layers of clothing served multiple purposes: concealment, protection from weather, and most importantly, the perfect costume for invisibility. Because the affluent never truly looked at the homeless, never saw them as fully human, never imagined that beneath the grime and desperation might exist intelligence, purpose, and more power than they could comprehend. Richard pulled his phone from his pocket with sharp, angry movements, scrolling to the building security contact with the irritated efficiency of someone accustomed to having problems eliminated before they fully registered in his consciousness. The early morning pedestrians flowed around him like water around a stone, their eyes sliding past the homeless man as if he didn't exist, as if poverty was a kind of camouflage that rendered its victims invisible to anyone who mattered. Two young professionals in matching grey suits walked past Arthur without breaking stride, their conversation about quarterly projections and market shares continuing uninterrupted, their expensive briefcases swinging mere inches from his outstretched hand. A woman in running gear jogged by, earbuds in, her face locked in that determined expression of someone using exercise to outrun thoughts she didn't want to confront. Her path taking her wide around the alcove where Arthur sat as if homelessness might be contagious. Richard watched these interactions with satisfaction, pleased that most people understood the unspoken rules of urban life, that you didn't acknowledge the failures, didn't engage with those who'd fallen through the cracks, maintained the comfortable fiction that success was the natural order and poverty an aberration that could be safely ignored. The security guard who responded to Richard's call arrived within 90 seconds. A thick-shouldered man named Frank, whose primary qualification was his willingness to enforce the building's aesthetic standards without asking uncomfortable questions about human dignity or social responsibility. Richard pointed toward Arthur with the casual gesture of someone indicating a spill that needed cleaning, a malfunction that required correction, his voice carrying that tone of barely restrained irritation that powerful men use when addressing subordinates. "Get him out of here," Richard said, not bothering to lower his voice, not concerned whether the homeless man heard, not interested in the human story that might explain how someone ended up sleeping on concrete in downtown Dallas. "I don't want to see him here tomorrow or next week, or ever again. Make sure he understands that this is private property, that we have standards, that there are places for people like him, and this isn't one of them." Frank nodded with the resigned expression of someone who'd performed this particular duty too many times to count, who'd learned to shut off the part of his conscience that might question whether following orders absolved him of moral responsibility. He approached Arthur slowly, hand moving to the radio on his belt, preparing for the possibility of resistance, even though this particular homeless man showed no signs of aggression or violence. Arthur looked up as the security guard's shadow fell across him, meeting Frank's eyes with a direct gaze that momentarily startled the larger man. Because homeless people weren't supposed to make eye contact, weren't supposed to look at you with that kind of clear, assessing intelligence that suggested they saw through uniforms and protocols to the human being beneath. For just a moment Frank hesitated, some instinct warning him that this situation wasn't what it appeared to be, that the man wrapped in filthy layers possessed a quality that didn't match his circumstances. But Richard was watching from near the building entrance, arms crossed, face set in that expression of impatient displeasure that Frank had learned meant his job security depended on swift compliance. "Sir, you need to move along," Frank said, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone delivering bad news he didn't personally endorse, but lacked the courage to refuse. "This is private property. You can't sleep here. There are shelters that can help you, but you can't stay here." Arthur gathered his belongings slowly, his movements deliberate rather than hurried, refusing to perform the panic or shame that Richard clearly expected, maintaining a dignity that seemed impossible given his circumstances, folding the cardboard sign and placing it carefully in the shopping cart as if it were a valuable document rather than garbage scrawled with desperate pleas that no one read anyway. Richard stood near the building entrance, arms crossed over his chest in that posture of masculine authority that men of power adopt when enforcing their will, watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a necessary but distasteful procedure. The morning sunlight caught the glass facade behind him, creating a halo effect that would have been ironic if anyone present possessed the perspective to appreciate it. The wealthy man bathed in artificial light while forcing a vulnerable human being back into the shadows. Several other executives had arrived during the confrontation, pausing in their trajectories from luxury vehicles to climate-controlled lobbies to witness the spectacle, their faces showing varying degrees of approval, discomfort, and carefully cultivated indifference. A younger man in his 30s, Marcus Chen, from the acquisitions department, stood nearby checking his phone with exaggerated focus, desperate to appear uninvolved while remaining close enough to gauge whether Richard noticed his presence and approved of his discretion. An older woman, Patricia Volkov, Senior Vice President of Operations, watched with lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, but said nothing because she'd learned decades ago that women in corporate environments had to choose their battles carefully, and defending homeless people against entitled CEOs wasn't a fight you could win. Arthur moved with painful slowness, gathering his possessions with the careful attention of someone for whom each item carried significance beyond its material value. A plastic bag containing clothes donated from a church, a thin blanket that provided almost no warmth but represented the difference between unbearable cold and merely miserable cold, a water bottle refilled from public fountains, the remnants of a dinner someone had thrown away but that still contained enough calories to sustain life for another day. Frank stood nearby, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but equally unwilling to abandon his position, his hand resting on his radio as if expecting Arthur to suddenly transform into a threat that justified this treatment. The shopping cart squeaked as Arthur pulled it from the alcove, one wheel slightly bent so that it pulled to the left, requiring constant correction, the sound grating in the early morning quiet like a reminder of mechanical failure in a world that prized seamless function. Richard's face tightened at the sound, at this prolonged disruption of his morning routine, at the fact that the homeless man wasn't simply vanishing, but instead taking his time, moving through the process of displacement with what almost seemed like deliberate slowness, designed to maximize the discomfort of everyone watching. The small crowd that had gathered, mostly Mercer Corporation employees arriving for the day, began to disperse as the confrontation lost its dramatic tension. People pulling out phones and resuming interrupted conversations, their brief flicker of attention already moving to more pressing concerns like meetings and deadlines, and the countless small anxieties that filled their professional lives. But a few remained, witnesses to this minor act of urban cruelty that would be forgotten by lunchtime, normalized into the background noise of city life, where the homeless were problems to be managed rather than humans deserving dignity. A young intern, fresh from college, watched with wide eyes that still held traces of idealism not yet crushed by corporate reality, her face showing the kind of troubled expression that suggested she might actually be processing what she was seeing rather than simply filing it away as unremarkable. Richard noticed her reaction and felt a flash of irritation. The young always brought their naive morality to the workplace, their college-educated ideas about fairness and compassion. Before experience taught them that business required harder edges, that success demanded the willingness to make decisions that made soft-hearted people uncomfortable. He made a mental note to have someone speak with her about appropriate professional detachment, about not letting personal feelings interfere with necessary corporate protocols. Arthur finally pulled his cart onto the sidewalk, standing fully upright for the first time since Richard had noticed him, revealing a height and bearing that seemed incongruous with his circumstances. There was something in the way he held himself, even wrapped in filth and exhaustion, that suggested he'd once carried authority, once moved through spaces with confidence, rather than the apologetic hunching that chronic homelessness usually produced. His eyes found Richard's across the 20 feet of concrete that separated them, holding the CEO's gaze for a long moment that stretched beyond comfortable social convention, beyond the brief eye contact that strangers exchange before looking away. Richard felt an unexpected prickle of unease, some primitive instinct whispering that this man was different, that beneath the costume of poverty existed someone who shouldn't be dismissed so easily, someone who was seeing and recording and judging in ways that might matter. But the feeling passed quickly, rationalized away by decades of certainty about his own importance, by the absolute conviction that his wealth and position insulated him from consequences, that the opinions of failures and homeless people held exactly zero weight in the reality he inhabited. "Next time I see you here," Richard said, his voice pitched to carry, wanting Arthur and everyone within earshot to hear, wanting to establish dominance not just in this moment, but in all future moments. "I'll have you arrested for trespassing. This is private property, and people like you need to understand boundaries, need to respect that we've built something here that doesn't include your kind." The words hung in the air like pollution, each syllable carrying layers of meaning beyond the literal content. The casual dismissal of shared humanity, the classification of people into categories of worthy and unworthy, the assumption that property rights trumped human need, the belief that success granted permission to humiliate those who'd failed. Arthur said nothing, didn't offer the apology or justification that Richard expected, didn't perform the appropriate shame and gratitude for not being treated even more harshly. Instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or something else entirely, then turned and began pushing his broken cart down the sidewalk, the squeaking wheel marking his passage like a small protest against the morning's violence. Frank watched Arthur disappear around the corner, then turned back to Richard, waiting for the acknowledgement or approval that employees seek when they've successfully completed an unpleasant task for their superiors. Richard was already moving toward the building entrance, the homeless man already forgotten, his mind shifting to the board meeting scheduled for that afternoon, to the quarterly reports that would demonstrate once again his genius for extracting profit from every available source, to the empire he'd built through ruthless efficiency and the absolute refusal to let sentiment interfere with business logic. The lobby doors whispered open with expensive hydraulics, welcoming him into the temperature-controlled paradise of the Mercer Tower's interior, where homeless people didn't exist, and every surface reflected his success back at him in chrome and marble and soaring architectural ambition. Patricia Volkov followed him inside, maintaining the three-step distance that corporate hierarchy required, her face troubled but silent, carrying the knowledge of what she'd witnessed like a small weight she'd eventually file away with all the other moral compromises required by professional survival. Behind them, the morning city continued its rhythm, thousands of people moving through spaces designed to facilitate commerce while rendering invisible those who'd fallen through the economic system's carefully constructed safety net. The elevator carried Richard upward through 37 floors of concentrated ambition, each level representing a different function in the vast machine of Mercer Corporation, accounting and legal on the lower floors, middle management scattered through the center like the organs of a living thing. Executive suites commanding the upper reaches where floor-to-ceiling windows offered views that reinforced the intoxicating sensation of being above everything, separate from the earthbound struggles of ordinary existence. Richard stood alone in the private executive elevator, watching the numbers climb on the digital display, each floor representing another layer of insulation from the street-level reality he'd just left behind. His reflection in the polished brass panels showed a man in complete control, every detail of his appearance calculated to project power. The suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the watch that served as a portable statement of wealth, the haircut maintained by a stylist who traveled from New York twice monthly to ensure no strand fell out of place. He straightened his already perfect tie, a habitual gesture that had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with the constant performance of dominance that his position required. The top floor emerged like a revelation as the elevator doors whispered open, presenting a vision of corporate luxury that had cost $7 million to design and construct, an open-plan space that somehow managed to feel both vast and intimate, with strategic walls of frosted glass creating private offices while maintaining the illusion of transparency. The morning light flooded through windows that wrapped around three sides of the building, offering views of downtown Dallas that transformed the city into an abstract painting of geometric shapes and carefully planned development. Richard's office occupied the northeast corner, a space large enough to contain most people's entire apartments, furnished with pieces that museums had tried to purchase, decorated with art that investment advisors recommended as holdings that would appreciate faster than stocks. His assistant, Jennifer, sat at her desk outside the office door, fingers already moving across her keyboard before he reached her, anticipating his needs with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to read his moods and requirements through 4 years of careful attention to every subtle signal. She was 42, perfectly professional, and smart enough to know that her job security depended on absolute invisibility. She needed to be present when required, and absent when not needed, to anticipate without presuming, to serve without expecting recognition for the countless small acts of labor that kept his world functioning smoothly. "Board meeting at 3, Jennifer said without looking up, her voice carrying just enough information without wasting his time with unnecessary detail. "The agenda's on your desk, but there's an additional item that was added late yesterday. The majority shareholder requested time to address the board directly. First time in 6 years he's attended a meeting in person." Richard paused mid-stride, hand already reaching for his office door handle, processing this unexpected disruption to what should have been a routine quarterly review. The majority shareholder was functionally a ghost, a name on documents that controlled 51% of company voting stock, but never interfered with Richard's management, never attended meetings or questioned decisions, existed only as a silent presence that Richard had learned to think of as essentially irrelevant to his day-to-day authority. The shares had belonged to Thomas Hale, the company's founder, and had passed to his estate after the old man's death 8 years ago, supposedly controlled by a son who disappeared before Richard had even joined the company, a figure so absent from corporate life that Richard sometimes forgot the shares weren't his own, that his control existed at the pleasure of someone he'd never met and couldn't name if pressed. "What does he want to address?" Richard asked, his voice carrying that edge of irritation that emerged whenever his absolute control was questioned or complicated by factors outside his influence. Jennifer finally looked up, her expression neutral, but her eyes showing a flicker of something that might have been concern or merely professional caution. The memo didn't specify. she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield, knowing that Richard's mood could turn dangerous when he felt his authority threatened even slightly. Just said he'd be attending and wanted 30 minutes at the end of the standard agenda. Legal confirmed his voting rights and scheduling priority. We can't refuse. Richard's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the door handle with enough force to turn his knuckles white, processing this information as an unwelcome intrusion into the carefully constructed reality where he made all decisions and others simply executed his vision. The majority shareholder attending a meeting suggested scrutiny, suggested questions, suggested the possibility that someone might actually challenge his leadership or question the aggressive strategies that had tripled company profits while laying off 15% of the workforce and relocating manufacturing to countries where labor laws were suggestions rather than requirements. He entered his office and let the door close behind him with a solid click that signaled he wasn't to be disturbed unless emergency circumstances required it, moving to the massive windows that offered a view of the city spreading outward in all directions like a kingdom awaiting his command. From this height, individual humans became invisible, reduced to the movement of vehicles and the play of light on building surfaces, an abstract representation of commerce and ambition that bore no relationship to the messy reality of lived experience. Richard stood with hands clasped behind his back, a posture he'd adopted from an old mentor who taught him that physical positioning reinforced psychological dominance, that men who controlled space controlled outcomes. The morning's confrontation with the homeless man felt distant now, already receding into irrelevance, just another minor irritation resolved through the application of appropriate authority. He didn't think about Arthur Hale's face, didn't wonder about the story that had led to someone sleeping on concrete in downtown Dallas, didn't consider that the man he'd humiliated might possess interior life or dignity or connections to anything that mattered in Richard's world. The homeless existed in a separate reality, one that only intersected with his when their presence created aesthetic problems that required correction. The day proceeded with its usual rhythm of meetings and calls and decisions that moved millions of dollars from one column to another in spreadsheets that determined whether factories stayed open or closed, whether communities thrived or withered, whether families maintained stability or slid into the kind of desperation Richard had witnessed that morning without truly seeing. He reviewed the quarterly reports with his CFO, a nervous man named Douglas, who sweated through expensive shirts while presenting numbers that should have been good news, but never seemed quite good enough to satisfy Richard's appetite for growth. He participated in a conference call with investors in Singapore who spoke in the clipped, efficient English of international finance, discussing market positioning and competitive advantages with the detached language that transformed human labor into units of production and human need into consumer demand curves. He approved termination packages for executives who'd failed to meet their targets, signing documents that would destroy careers and destabilize families with the same casual gesture he used to approve office supplies, never considering that these signatures represented moments of personal catastrophe for the people whose names appeared on the termination forms. Lunch arrived at his desk in white containers from the Japanese restaurant that charged $40 for bowls of rice and raw fish, arranged with the precision of religious art. Food that tasted primarily of exclusivity and the knowledge that most people couldn't afford to eat this way, that his meal cost more than Arthur Hale might see in a month of begging on street corners. Richard ate while reviewing the board meeting agenda, his eyes scanning the familiar items: financial performance, strategic initiatives, market analysis, stockholder communications, before landing on the final item, the mysterious appearance of the majority shareholder who'd remained invisible for nearly a decade. The absence of detail troubled him, suggested planning and purpose rather than casual attendance, implied that something was happening beyond his control or awareness. He buzzed Jennifer and asked her to have legal pull everything they had on Thomas Hale's estate, on the son who'd inherited controlling interest, on any communication or documentation that might explain why someone who'd never cared about the company suddenly decided to attend a board meeting on this particular afternoon. She promised information within the hour, her voice carrying that soothing tone of competent assistance that he'd come to depend on, that made him feel that problems would be handled and threats would be neutralized before they fully materialized. The boardroom occupied the entire west side of the top floor, a cathedral of corporate authority, where 15 chairs surrounded a table crafted from a single massive piece of mahogany that had required 6 months of negotiation to source and another 3 months to properly cure and finish. The walls held portraits of the company's previous leaders, men in dark suits staring out from gilded frames, with expressions that suggested they'd conquered territory rather than managed a corporation, their painted eyes following whoever moved through the space with the unsettling quality of judgment that transcended time. Richard had commissioned his own portrait 3 years earlier, hanging it in the position of honor behind the head of the table, wanting anyone who entered to see him first, to understand immediately who controlled this space and the empire it represented. The afternoon light streamed through windows that faced west toward the suburbs, toward the sprawl of development that represented markets and consumers, and the endless appetite for products that the corporation existed to satisfy. He stood at his position at the table's head, reviewing notes that Jennifer had compiled about the mysterious majority shareholder, finding very little concrete information and a great deal of frustrating absence. Thomas Hale had founded the company 60 years earlier, building it from a single manufacturing facility into a diversified corporation with operations spanning 3 continents and annual revenues approaching $2 billion. The old man had been legendary for his personal approach to business, known for learning the names of factory workers and visiting manufacturing floors, for establishing profit-sharing programs and educational benefits that had seemed eccentric to his contemporaries but had generated fierce employee loyalty. He'd stepped back from active management 20 years ago, maintaining controlling interest but allowing professional CEOs to run daily operations, watching from a distance as the company evolved from his founding vision into something more efficient and considerably less concerned with the social mission that had originally motivated its creation. Thomas had died 8 years ago, and his controlling shares had passed to his only son, Arthur Hale, a figure so absent from corporate life that Richard had assumed he was either incapacitated or simply uninterested in the fortune he'd inherited. The legal documents showed Arthur had signed proxy agreements, giving Richard full management authority, had never attended a stockholder meeting, had never communicated with the board or requested financial information, had basically acted like someone who'd inherited wealth but wanted nothing to do with the source that generated it. But now Arthur Hale was coming to the board meeting, breaking 8 years of silence with a request to address the board directly, and the timing felt deliberate in ways that Richard couldn't quite articulate, but that triggered instincts developed through decades of corporate combat. He'd asked Jennifer to find a photograph of Arthur Hale, wanting to know what the majority shareholder looked like, wanting some concrete detail to work with instead of this frustrating abstraction. She'd found one image from 15 years ago, a formal portrait taken at some charity function where Arthur stood beside his father, both men in tuxedos, Arthur looking younger and more groomed than the 60-something years he'd be now, his face showing the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up with wealth and position, never having to prove himself or fight for recognition. Richard studied that old photograph, trying to project forward to what Arthur Hale might look like now, wondering if years of absence had softened him, or whether he'd maintained the bearing of inherited authority, whether he'd be easy to manage, or whether this appearance signaled the beginning of complications that Richard hadn't anticipated and didn't want. The board members began arriving at 2:30, 30 minutes before the official start time, each making their entrance with the careful choreography that corporate hierarchies required, acknowledgement of Richard's presence without excessive deference, casual conversation that avoided anything substantive, positioning themselves in chairs that reflected their place in the pecking order, without anyone explicitly discussing the arrangement. Patricia Volkov arrived first, as she usually did, taking her seat 3 positions down from Richard's right hand, her face showing the professional composure that had carried her through 30 years of corporate evolution and countless regime changes. Marcus Chen followed, younger and more eager, sitting directly to Richard's right, in the position of ambitious lieutenant hoping for advancement through demonstrated loyalty. The others filtered in. The CFO with his nervous energy and sweat-stained collars, the general counsel with her careful neutrality and files full of protective documentation, the vice presidents of various divisions who'd learned that survival meant supporting whoever currently held power while maintaining enough independence to shift allegiance if circumstances changed. By 2:55, everyone had assembled except for the mysterious majority shareholder whose impending arrival had transformed what should have been a routine meeting into something else, something that felt like anticipation, edging toward dread. Richard called the meeting to order with his usual authority, his voice filling the space with the practiced projection of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed, moving through the standard agenda items with efficiency that bordered on impatience. The quarterly financial results were strong, profits up 14% compared to the previous year, stock price maintaining steady growth that kept investors satisfied and quiet. The cost-cutting measures he'd implemented had worked exactly as projected, eliminating redundant positions and streamlining operations in ways that boosted margins, even if they'd also eliminated jobs that real people had depended on to feed families and maintain mortgages. Nobody around the table questioned these decisions. They nodded and took notes and asked questions about implementation details without touching the underlying ethics of destroying livelihoods in service of stockholder returns. This was business. This was how the world worked. This was what success looked like when you stripped away sentiment and focused on the numbers that actually mattered. The final agenda item arrived at 3:27, and the boardroom door opened to admit a figure that initially seemed wrong, seemed like some kind of mistake or confusion about who was supposed to be arriving for this critical moment. The man who entered wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, suggesting recent measurement and expensive construction by craftsmen who understood how fabric should drape on a human frame. His face was clean-shaven, revealing strong bone structure and eyes that carried intelligence and something else, something harder and more assessing than Richard expected from someone who'd been absent from corporate life for 8 years. His hair was professionally cut, grey at the temples in a way that suggested wisdom rather than age, and he moved with the casual confidence of someone completely comfortable in spaces of power and authority. He wasn't what Richard had imagined when trying to picture the mysterious Arthur Hale, wasn't the soft playboy or disinterested air that absence had suggested, wasn't someone who could be easily dismissed or managed through the usual mechanisms of corporate control. Richard felt his stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the building's construction or any physical sensation, a purely psychological plunge as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were reporting, fought against the impossible connection between the clean, authoritative man now moving to the head of the conference table and the filthy, broken figure he'd humiliated on the sidewalk that morning. It couldn't be the same person. The homeless man had been wrapped in layers of grime and desperation, had smelled of streets and abandonment, had embodied everything that Richard understood as failure and worthlessness. While this figure in the expensive suit carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd never known vulnerability or powerlessness. But as Arthur Hale moved closer, as Richard got a clear view of his face in the unforgiving fluorescent light of the boardroom, the recognition became undeniable. Those same eyes that had met his on the sidewalk, that same direct gaze that had made him momentarily uncomfortable before he dismissed the feeling as irrelevant, that same quality of assessment and judgment that shouldn't have been possible in someone sleeping on concrete in downtown Dallas. Arthur took his time moving to the front of the room, letting the board members register his presence, watching their faces shift from curiosity to confusion to dawning comprehension as they realized this wasn't some corporate functionary or legal representative, but the actual majority shareholder, the man who controlled 51% of the company's voting stock and therefore held more real power than everyone in this room combined, including Richard with all his carefully cultivated authority and aggressive management style. Patricia Volkov's eyes widened slightly, her professional composure cracking just enough to reveal genuine surprise, while Marcus Chen looked between Arthur and Richard with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't fit together in any logical pattern. The CFO had actually stopped sweating for once, frozen in his chair like an animal that sensed predator presence but hadn't yet decided which direction to run. The general counsel's face remained carefully neutral, but her hands moved to the files in front of her, fingers already searching for documentation that might explain or protect or provide some framework for understanding what was happening in this moment of fundamental disruption. "Good afternoon," Arthur said, his voice carrying easily through the room without requiring raised volume or theatrical projection. The natural authority of someone whose power derived from ownership rather than position or performance. "I apologize for my extended absence from company affairs. I've been conducting research into how the corporation my father built has evolved during my time away, observing from perspectives that most board members never experience, learning things about our operations and leadership that financial reports and official communications could never reveal." He paused, letting that statement settle in the air, watching the various faces around the table process the implications, seeing the moment when several people began to understand that his absence hadn't been disengagement, but something else entirely. Something deliberate and calculated and potentially dangerous to their comfortable assumptions about how power functioned in this organization. Richard felt his throat tighten, felt sweat beginning to form along his collar despite the temperature-controlled perfection of the boardroom climate, felt the first whispers of genuine fear beginning to displace the confident certainty that had defined his morning. Arthur's gaze moved slowly around the table, making brief eye contact with each board member, an inventory that felt like judgment, even though he hadn't yet said anything explicitly critical or accusatory. When his eyes finally settled on Richard, the CEO felt exposed in ways he hadn't experienced since childhood, since the days before wealth and position had insulated him from consequence or genuine vulnerability, since he'd understood that the world could touch him in ways that couldn't be controlled or managed through the usual mechanisms of power and intimidation. "Mr. Mercer," Arthur said, his tone conversational, but carrying undertones that everyone in the room could hear, could feel like pressure changes before a storm. "I believe we had an interaction this morning that you may not have fully understood at the time. You ordered security to remove a homeless man from the front of this building, someone you described as people like him, who needed to understand boundaries and respect that you'd built something here that didn't include their kind." The words landed like physical objects, each phrase a small detonation in the carefully controlled atmosphere. Several board members shifting uncomfortably in their chairs as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that felt like exposure or reckoning rather than routine corporate business. Richard's face flushed red, the color rising from his collar to his hairline in a visible wave of humiliation and rage and desperate confusion about how to respond to this violation of every social and professional protocol that usually governed these spaces. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his brain struggling to formulate a response that could somehow explain or justify or minimize what had happened, that tentar novamente e continua morning, searching for words that could transform his cruelty into something defensible or at least understandable within the logic of property rights and business necessity. But nothing came. No smooth corporate language could disguise what Arthur was describing. No appeal to security concerns or aesthetic standards could erase the fundamental meanness of what Richard had done. The casual dehumanization that had seemed so natural and justified just hours ago, but now felt like evidence of something rotten in his character. Something that everyone in this room was witnessing and judging. Patricia Volkov's expression had shifted from surprise to something harder, her eyes moving between Arthur and Richard with the calculation of someone reassessing alliances and determining which direction power was actually flowing. Marcus Chen had gone pale, suddenly realizing that his position close to Richard might not be the advantage he'd imagined, might actually be proximity to someone whose authority was crumbling in real time. "That homeless man was me," Arthur continued, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge now, a blade hidden in velvet that everyone could feel even if they couldn't see it clearly. "I've spent the last 6 months living on the streets of Dallas, sleeping in doorways and under bridges, eating from trash bins and begging for change, experiencing firsthand what happens to human beings when they fall through the economic structures that corporations like ours have helped create. I wanted to understand what my father's legacy had become, whether the company he built on principles of compassion and social responsibility still retained any of those values, or whether profit maximization had completely consumed the moral foundation that once differentiated us from every other corporation pursuing quarterly gains at any human cost." He pulled a small tablet from his jacket pocket, touching the screen to wake it, then projecting an image onto the large display screen that dominated one wall of the boardroom. The image showed Richard standing on the sidewalk that morning, arm extended in that pointing gesture of command and contempt, his face captured in perfect clarity, showing the expression of disgust and dismissal that he'd worn while ordering Arthur's removal, while reducing another human being to a problem requiring elimination rather than a person deserving basic dignity. The boardroom fell into silence so complete that individual breathing became audible. The whisper of expensive fabric against leather chairs, the faint hum of the building's ventilation system pushing filtered air through precisely calibrated ducts. Richard stared at the image of himself, seeing his own face frozen in that moment of casual cruelty, recognizing the expression, but also seeing it as others must see it. Not as justified authority, but as something uglier, something that revealed character more honestly than any carefully crafted public persona or strategic communication could conceal. He wanted to argue that context was missing, that property rights and security concerns justified his actions, that homeless people camping outside corporate headquarters created real problems that required firm responses. But the words died in his throat because Arthur's presence transformed everything. This wasn't about property management or urban policy. This was about how Richard treated human beings when he believed they held no power, when he thought his actions would never face consequences or scrutiny, when he assumed that wealth and position granted permission to humiliate those who'd lost everything and landed in circumstances that Richard had never bothered to imagine could happen to someone like him or anyone he actually cared about. Arthur advanced another slide, this one showing a different angle of the same scene, capturing Frank, the security guard, grabbing Arthur's shoulder, Richard watching with arms crossed in satisfied approval. Several other Mercer Corporation employees visible in the background, their faces showing various reactions to the spectacle they were witnessing. "I documented 12 similar incidents over 6 months, Arthur said, his voice still measured but carrying weight now. The accumulated evidence of pattern rather than isolated mistake, systematic failure rather than momentary lapse. 12 times when employees of this corporation encountered vulnerable human beings and chose cruelty over compassion, humiliation over help, protection of aesthetic standards over recognition of shared humanity. Mr. Mercer's behavior this morning wasn't exceptional. It was perfectly representative of the culture that has developed here during his leadership, the values that actually govern decision-making when nobody important is watching. When the quarterly reports and stockholder presentations give way to how we actually treat people who can't fight back or threaten our positions or offer anything we want. Doom. The slides continued cycling, each image showing another moment of casual inhumanity. Security guards forcing homeless people away from building entrances, employees stepping over people sleeping on sidewalks without breaking stride, maintenance staff hosing down alcoves where vulnerable humans had sought shelter, creating a visual archive of systematic indifference that couldn't be explained away as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Patricia Volkov was the first board member to speak, her voice careful but carrying an undertone of something that might have been relief at finally being able to articulate concerns she'd carried silently for years. Watching the company drift away from its founding principles without possessing the power to challenge the direction Richard had imposed through sheer force of personality and quarterly results that satisfied stockholders who never looked beyond profit margins to examine the human cost of achieving those numbers. "Mr. Hale," she said, using his name with deliberate formality that signaled respect and recognition of his authority. "Many of us have been troubled by certain aspects of corporate culture under Mr. Mercer's leadership, but felt constrained by fiduciary responsibility and the strong financial performance that made questioning his methods seem disloyal or naive. If you're here to propose changes, I think you'll find more support around this table than you might expect. More people who've been waiting for someone with actual authority to acknowledge that profit and principle don't have to be opposing forces, that we can be successful without sacrificing the values your father embedded in this organization's foundation." Her words opened a floodgate. Suddenly other board members were nodding, adding their own carefully phrased criticisms of policies they'd voted for publicly while harboring private doubts, confessing discomfort with decisions they'd supported because Richard's aggression made opposition feel dangerous and futile. Richard watched his authority dissolve in real time, watched people who'd supported every initiative and praised every decision, suddenly revealing that their loyalty had been performance rather than conviction, that they'd been waiting for permission to abandon him, that his power had been more fragile than he'd ever imagined because it rested on position rather than genuine respect or shared values. He tried to speak, to mount some defense or assert his record of financial success, to remind everyone that his strategies had tripled stock value and delivered returns that made all of them wealthier than they'd been before his leadership. But Arthur raised one hand in a gesture that somehow commanded silence more effectively than any shouted demand. His authority, deriving from ownership and moral clarity rather than volume or aggression, his calm demeanor more powerful than Richard's carefully cultivated intimidation had ever been. "Mr. Mercer," Arthur said, his voice carrying finality that everyone in the room recognized as irreversible judgment, the moment when consequence arrived for years of cruelty disguised as business necessity. "You're fired. Effective immediately, you no longer have any role in this corporation's management or operations. Security will escort you from the building within the hour, and legal will contact you regarding severance terms and the return of company property." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, reshaping reality through their mere utterance, transforming Richard from supreme authority to terminated employee in the space between heartbeats, collapsing years of carefully constructed power into sudden irrelevance that felt like falling from a great height without any warning or preparation. Richard's face went through several distinct transformations, shock giving way to rage attempting to mount some resistance before crumbling into something closer to panic as his brain processed that this wasn't negotiable or reversible, that Arthur Hale controlled 51% of voting stock and could make this decision without requiring board approval or consensus or any consideration of Richard's opinion about his own termination. His hands gripped the edge of the conference table with enough force to turn knuckles white, as if holding onto wood could somehow anchor him against the dissolution of everything he'd built, everything he'd become, every assumption about his importance and permanence in the world. His mouth opened and closed, searching for arguments or appeals or threats that might somehow reverse what was happening, but finding only empty air and the humiliating realization that nothing he could say would matter because he'd fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his power, had mistaken temporary position for permanent authority, had never considered that someone might actually hold him accountable for treating vulnerable humans as disposable obstacles to aesthetic perfection. Marcus Chen had actually pushed his chair back from the table, physically distancing himself from Richard as if proximity to the fallen CEO might contaminate him through association, might mark him as complicit in the cruelty that Arthur's presentation had documented so thoroughly and displayed so publicly that denial was impossible. The young executive's face showed naked calculation now, the rapid reassessment of alliances that ambitious people perform when power structures shift unexpectedly, determining who to align with and who to abandon, based purely on which direction would advance his career and protect his position. Patricia Volkov maintained more dignity, but her expression carried unmistakable satisfaction. The relief of someone who'd waited years for justice that she'd stopped believing would ever arrive, who'd witnessed countless small cruelties and larger policy decisions that violated her conscience, but that she'd lacked the power to effectively oppose. The CFO had resumed sweating, his nervous system apparently responding to the stress in the room, regardless of whether he personally was threatened, his files forgotten, as he watched the drama unfold with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away even though the spectacle was deeply uncomfortable. Arthur moved to take Richard's position at the head of the table, not aggressively or with theatrical triumph, but with the calm confidence of someone reclaiming space that had always belonged to him, that he'd temporarily allowed others to occupy while conducting the investigation that had culminated in this moment of reckoning. Richard remained frozen in his chair for several seconds, unable to process the instruction to leave, unable to accept that his reign was actually ending, that he was being dismissed like any other employee who'd failed to meet performance standards or violated company policy. "You can't do this," Richard finally managed to say, his voice coming out hoarse and smaller than he intended, stripped of the commanding authority that usually characterized his speech. "The board has to approve termination of the CEO. There are contracts, severance agreements, procedures that have to be followed. You can't just walk in here and unilaterally fire me regardless of your stock position." The words were technically correct, but everyone in the room understood they were also meaningless. Arthur's controlling interest gave him absolute authority over major corporate decisions, and CEO termination certainly qualified as major, even if protocols existed that would normally be observed. "The board will formalize my decision at an emergency meeting tomorrow," Arthur said, his tone suggesting he was stating obvious facts rather than engaging in argument or negotiation. "Legal has already reviewed the employment contract and determined that immediate termination with cause is permitted when the CEO's actions violate the company's stated values and code of conduct in ways that threaten corporate reputation and legal liability. Your treatment of homeless individuals on company property, documented thoroughly over 6 months, constitutes such violation. The severance package will be minimal because termination is for cause rather than restructuring or performance issues. You'll receive 30 days of salary continuation and health insurance coverage through the end of the month, but no bonus, no equity acceleration, and no letters of recommendation that might help you secure another position of similar authority and compensation." Each sentence landed like a hammer blow, systematically dismantling not just Richard's current position, but his entire future, his ability to leverage this role into the next opportunity. His carefully cultivated reputation as a successful CEO whose aggressive strategies delivered results that boards valued despite the human costs those strategies imposed. Richard finally stood, his movement jerky and uncoordinated in ways that suggested his body was responding to commands his conscious mind hadn't fully formulated, some primitive survival instinct telling him to flee the space where his humiliation was being witnessed by everyone whose respect and fear had once fed his sense of importance and power. He looked around the table one final time, searching faces for some sign of support or sympathy, or at least discomfort at watching his destruction, but finding only carefully neutral expressions and a few barely concealed expressions of satisfaction at seeing someone who'd ruled through intimidation finally experiencing powerlessness himself. Patricia Volkov met his eyes with steady directness. No apology or regret visible in her face, her entire demeanor communicating that this outcome was appropriate and deserved and long overdue. Marcus Chen was actively avoiding eye contact now, studying his hands or the table, or anything that allowed him to pretend he wasn't witnessing his former mentor's complete dismantling. The General Counsel had her phone out, presumably already communicating with security about Richard's imminent escort from the building, treating his removal as a logistics problem requiring efficient management rather than a human drama deserving emotional consideration. The walk from the boardroom to the elevator felt endless, despite being less than 50 feet. Every step carrying Richard past offices and cubicles, where employees would soon hear about his termination and probably celebrate the fall of someone who'd never bothered to learn their names or acknowledge their contributions beyond what quarterly reports required. Jennifer was still at her desk when he emerged from the boardroom, her face showing that she'd somehow already heard what happened. Maybe someone had texted her. Maybe she'd simply intuited the outcome from the timing and Arthur's presence. Maybe she possessed that sixth sense that administrative assistants develop after years of reading corporate atmospherics and power shifts. Her expression showed something Richard had never seen directed at him before. Pity mixed with the careful distance of someone protecting themselves from association with failure, already mentally updating her resume and preparing to serve whoever would take his position, treating his presence as temporary inconvenience rather than the authority she'd served loyally for 4 years. "They're sending someone from security to escort you out," she said, her voice gentle but also final, the tone you'd use with someone who no longer had power over your employment or future, who'd transformed from important figure to irrelevant person in the span of one afternoon. The security guard who arrived wasn't frank. Richard felt grateful for that small mercy. grateful to not face the man who'd helped him humiliate Arthur that morning, who'd witnessed Richard's casual cruelty, and now would have heard about the spectacular reversal that cruelty had triggered. Instead, a younger guard named Tom appeared, his face professionally neutral, treating this as routine even though walking a CEO out of his own building was anything but routine. Was actually the kind of story that would circulate through security networks and break rooms, that would be told and retold as evidence that even the powerful could fall, that accountability sometimes arrived even for those who thought themselves insulated from consequence. Tom stood at a respectful distance, while Richard gathered personal items from his office, the family photos that had been more performance than genuine sentiment, the awards and recognition plaques that suddenly seemed worthless without the position they'd been awarded to validate, the expensive pen that some vendor had given him and that he'd treasured as symbol of his importance and taste. Everything fit in a single cardboard box, the physical accumulation of years of work reducing to something that could be carried with two hands, the material residue of authority and success fitting easily in a container that homeless people used to collect cans for recycling. The elevator ride down felt different from the ascent that morning. The same mechanical function producing opposite emotional experience, where climbing had reinforced Richard's sense of being above everything, separate from ordinary human struggle and consequence. The descent felt like falling in slow motion, each floor marking another layer of protection and illusion being stripped away, until only the vulnerable human beneath the CEO costume remained. Richard watched the numbers decrease on the digital display, 37 to 36 to 35, each floor representing positions and people who would no longer respect or fear him, who would hear about his firing and make their own calculations about whether to maintain relationships that no longer served their professional interests. Tom stood silent beside him, hands clasped in front of his body in that security stance that suggested watchfulness without explicit threat, his presence transforming Richard from autonomous agent to supervised subject, someone whose movements now required monitoring and control because he no longer belonged in spaces he'd once commanded. The box of personal items felt heavy in Richard's arms, the weight somehow greater than the physical objects could account for, as if he carried not just photos and awards, but the accumulated reality of failure and exposure and the complete dissolution of the identity he'd spent decades constructing. The lobby appeared through the elevator doors like a stage set designed to maximize his humiliation. The vast space, with its marble floors and soaring ceiling, suddenly feeling like an arena where his exit would be witnessed by dozens of employees who would carry the story forward, who would tell others about seeing Richard Mercer walked out of his own building like any terminated employee who'd violated company policy or failed to meet performance standards. Several people actually stopped mid-conversation to watch, their attention drawn by the unusual sight of security escorting someone in an expensive suit, their faces showing recognition, followed by shocked comprehension as they realized who was being removed. That the CEO who'd seemed untouchable that morning was now being expelled from the tower he'd claimed as personal domain and symbol of his permanence in Dallas's corporate hierarchy. Richard kept his eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the watchers, maintaining what dignity remained by declining to perform the shame that they clearly expected, that public humiliation traditionally required from those experiencing downfall and exposure. But inside, behind the carefully maintained expression of neutral composure, his mind was racing through implications and consequences, calculating what came next when the only thing you'd built your identity around was suddenly and permanently removed. Tom walked him through the lobby doors out onto the sidewalk where the morning's confrontation had occurred, the concrete still holding faint traces of where Arthur's shopping cart had rested, where a homeless man had curled against building walls seeking warmth, and instead found cruelty from someone who'd never imagined that positions could reverse, that the powerful could become powerless and the invisible could reveal themselves as holding authority that rendered all other authority meaningless. The afternoon sun felt harsh after the climate-controlled perfection of the tower interior. The heat and humidity of Dallas in late spring pressing against Richard's expensive suit like physical reminder that he was back on ground level now, back among the earthbound realities that his position had temporarily insulated him from, but that were actually permanent, while his authority had been only temporary. Richard stood on the sidewalk, holding his box of belongings, suddenly aware that he had no clear destination, no office to return to, no meetings scheduled, no calls to make that would matter because the position that had made his calls meaningful was gone, stripped away in 30 minutes of boardroom exposure that felt like violence, even though Arthur's tone had remained calm and his facts had been undeniable. His car was still in the executive parking garage, but the thought of retrieving it felt overwhelming. Required walking back into the building and facing more witnesses to his diminishment, more people who would see him and know what had happened and make their own judgments about whether he deserved this fate or whether Arthur's revenge had been disproportionate to the morning's confrontation. Richard started walking instead, moving down the sidewalk with no particular destination, just putting distance between himself and the tower that no longer belonged to him, that would tomorrow hold the same meetings and produce the same work, but without his presence or authority, or the fear and respect that had defined his relationship to everyone who worked there. The cardboard box grew heavier with each block, his arms beginning to ache from carrying what suddenly seemed like worthless objects, meaningless awards, and empty recognition from a life that had just revealed itself as more fragile and contingent than he'd ever allowed himself to acknowledge. Other pedestrians flowed around him without interest or recognition, just another person on downtown sidewalks, indistinguishable from any other body moving through urban space, no longer marked by power or position or the kind of importance that made strangers step aside and clear paths without being asked. 3 blocks from Mercer Tower, Richard passed a homeless man sitting against a building wall, cardboard sign propped beside him with words asking for help and mercy from people whose lives contained enough excess that they might spare change without genuine sacrifice. Richard's first instinct was the same disgust and irritation he'd felt that morning, the automatic recoil from visible poverty and need, the desire to look away and maintain the comfortable fiction that homelessness happened to others for reasons that had nothing to do with luck or circumstance or the brutal efficiency of economic systems that created winners and losers without much concern for whether outcomes reflected merit or simple survival during moments when everything collapsed. But this time, something stopped the automatic response. Maybe exhaustion, maybe the morning's revelation that surfaces concealed truths he'd never bothered investigating. Maybe the fresh experience of having his own life upended in ways he couldn't control or prevent or explain through comfortable narratives about deserving what you achieved. He stopped walking, stood looking at the homeless man for several seconds, really seeing him instead of just registering his presence as aesthetic problem requiring avoidance or removal. The man looked back with eyes that held intelligence and pain, and the kind of resigned expectation that most people would simply pass without acknowledgement, that visibility didn't guarantee recognition, that needing help made you invisible to those whose help you needed most. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, the expensive leather holder that contained credit cards that would still work until tomorrow when corporate accounts were frozen. Cash that represented the last liquid assets he could access before lawyers and accountants began the complicated process of determining what severance he'd actually receive and how much he'd be able to maintain of the lifestyle he'd built through years of aggressive management and the willingness to prioritize profit over every competing value. He removed two $20 bills, holding them for a moment while his brain argued with itself about whether this gesture meant anything or changed anything, or was just performance of conscience that cost him nothing meaningful, while doing nothing to address the systematic problems that created homelessness in cities that contained more empty housing units than homeless people. But he handed the money to the homeless man anyway, not saying anything because words seemed inadequate or false, not expecting gratitude or transformation or redemption through this small transaction. The man took the bills with a quiet "thank you," his expression showing surprise that suggested most people didn't stop, didn't give, didn't acknowledge his presence enough to offer even this minimal assistance that couldn't change his circumstances but might buy food or shelter for another night or two before the money ran out and he was back to begging from strangers who mostly pretended he didn't exist. Richard resumed walking, the cardboard box still heavy in his arms. His mind, turning over questions he'd never bothered asking before today, forced them on him. How did people end up homeless? What sequences of bad luck or bad decisions or systematic exclusion resulted in sleeping on sidewalks in one of the wealthiest countries in human history? Whether the contempt he'd always felt for visible poverty reflected actual moral failure by the poor, or was just defensive mechanism that protected the wealthy from having to acknowledge their own good fortune and the arbitrary nature of who succeeded and who failed in economic systems, designed to produce both winners and losers, regardless of individual merit or effort. The questions didn't produce answers, just generated more questions, opening thought patterns that felt uncomfortable because they undermined certainties he'd built his worldview around. Certainties that had justified his treatment of people like Arthur that morning, people whose circumstances had seemed like evidence of personal failure, rather than broader systematic problems that he benefited from without acknowledging or accepting any responsibility for addressing. The afternoon stretched toward evening, shadows lengthening between buildings, the city beginning its transition from business hours to whatever came after. And Richard Mercer walked through it all carrying everything he'd accumulated and everything he'd lost in a single cardboard box that somehow weighed more than any burden he'd carried in his entire previous life. Richard found himself at a coffee shop 6 blocks from Mercer Tower, a generic chain location that he'd never entered during his years of executive authority because CEOs didn't drink coffee in public spaces designed for ordinary consumers. They had assistants who brought premium beverages to their desks, had private cafeterias in executive suites, had every need anticipated and satisfied without requiring exposure to the casual democracy of public commerce, where everyone waited in the same line regardless of wealth or position. He ordered a black coffee from a barista who didn't recognize him, didn't know or care that hours earlier he'd controlled a corporation worth hundreds of millions, who treated him exactly like every other customer with the efficient disinterest of service workers performing transactions without emotional investment. Richard carried his coffee to a table near the window, setting down the cardboard box that had accompanied his exile, staring out at the Dallas streets with vision that felt simultaneously clearer and more confused than any perception he'd experienced in years. The coffee was mediocre, neither terrible nor particularly good, just adequate caffeine delivery that cost $4 and came without the performance of exclusivity that usually marked his consumption choices. The evening crowds moved past the coffee shop windows, professionals heading home after long days, students carrying backpacks and the particular exhaustion that education produced, tourists consulting phones and looking for restaurants or entertainment, all of them living lives that had nothing to do with Richard Mercer or the drama that had consumed his afternoon, all of them pursuing their own concerns and crises without awareness that someone's entire world had just collapsed in a boardroom 37 floors above street level. Richard watched them with something approaching wonder. realizing that he'd spent decades treating other humans as background characters in his personal narrative, extras whose function was to support his journey toward greater wealth and power and recognition, never quite believing that they possessed interior lives as complex and real as his own, never imagining that his importance existed only in his own mind and the minds of people whose careers made pretending he mattered a professional necessity. The realization felt like vertigo, like discovering that gravity worked differently than you'd always assumed, that the center of the universe you'd occupied turned out to be just another point in vast networks of human experience where everyone was simultaneously protagonist of their own story, an extra in everyone else's. His phone buzzed with incoming messages that he'd been ignoring since leaving the building. Texts from colleagues expressing shock or sympathy or carefully neutral acknowledgement that avoided taking sides while the full story remained unclear. Emails from business contacts who'd somehow already heard about his termination and were reaching out to either offer support or begin the process of distancing themselves, depending on their calculations, about whether association with failure would damage their own positions and reputations. Richard scrolled through them without responding, recognizing the performance of concern that professional networks required, understanding that most of these messages came from obligation rather than genuine care, that his relationships had been transactional arrangements based on mutual utility rather than authentic connection that might survive the loss of his position and power. One message stopped his scrolling. A brief note from Patricia Volkov that simply said, "You had opportunities to change, you chose not to. This outcome was always coming." No sympathy, no regret, just statement of fact from someone who'd watched him for years, who'd seen chances for different choices and different priorities, who'd concluded that his downfall represented justice rather than tragedy because he'd created the conditions for his own destruction through systematic cruelty that Arthur's test had simply documented and revealed. The coffee shop gradually emptied as evening deepened toward night, customers finishing drinks and leaving to pursue dinner plans or return to homes where people waited for them, where their presence mattered to others in ways that had nothing to do with professional utility or corporate hierarchies. Richard remained at his table, the cardboard box beside him, unwilling to face the mansion in the suburbs where he lived alone in 8,000 square feet of expensive emptiness. Rooms filled with furniture that interior designers had selected and art that investment advisors had recommended, but that Richard had never actually looked at with attention or appreciation for anything beyond their monetary value and status signification. The house would feel different now, would become evidence of everything he'd prioritized and everything he'd sacrificed to acquire possessions that suddenly seemed meaningless without the position that had justified their acquisition and made them markers of success rather than just expensive objects occupying space. He thought about his ex-wife, divorced 6 years ago, because marriage had required attention and emotional availability that competed with the absolute focus that building corporate power demanded, who'd left when she realized that Richard's relationship to the company was primary, while every human connection remained secondary or irrelevant, when conflicts arose between personal needs and professional ambitions. Arthur Hale would be in the boardroom now, or perhaps in Richard's former office, beginning the process of redirecting the corporation back towards something resembling the founder's original vision, restoring programs that Richard had eliminated as wasteful sentimentality that reduced profit margins without producing measurable returns, rebuilding connections to communities and employees that Richard had treated as resources to be optimized rather than stakeholders deserving consideration in decision-making processes. The change wouldn't be immediate or easy. Corporations developed cultures that persisted beyond individual leaders, systems that resisted transformation even when new priorities were declared, employees who'd learned to survive by adapting to prevailing values, and who would need time and evidence before believing that different approaches would actually be rewarded rather than punished. But Arthur had majority control, had moral authority derived from his father's legacy and his own willingness to test corporate character from positions of vulnerability, had documented evidence of systematic failures that made arguing for status quo impossible, without explicitly defending cruelty as business necessity. The company would change, would become something different than what Richard had shaped it into, would pursue success through means that acknowledged responsibilities beyond shareholder returns and quarterly profit maximization. Richard finished his coffee, the cup long since cold, the liquid at the bottom tasting bitter and stale, but providing something to do with his hands, while his mind processed implications that kept expanding the longer he sat with them. He'd spent his entire adult life climbing toward positions of greater authority and compensation, sacrificing relationships and health and any concerns beyond professional advancement, building toward some imagined destination where success would feel complete and permanent and finally sufficient to justify everything he'd done to achieve it. But the destination had never arrived. Each achievement immediately revealed another goal beyond it. Each milestone became starting point for the next climb, rather than resting place where satisfaction could be experienced and enjoyed. And now, at 55, with decades of corporate combat behind him and no clear path forward, Richard confronted the possibility that he'd optimized his life toward the wrong variables, that the metrics he'd used to measure success had missed everything that actually mattered, that wealth and power without compassion or connection or sense of responsibility to others produced emptiness disguised as achievement. The realization felt like standing in ruins of a kingdom he'd spent his life building, understanding too late that the foundation was sand, that the whole structure had been collapsing slowly, even during years when it appeared most solid and impressive. Outside the coffee shop windows, Dallas continued its evening rhythm, lights coming on in office towers and residential buildings, the city transforming into patterns of illumination against darkness, each lit window representing lives being lived in ways that Richard had never bothered to imagine or value, when those lives didn't directly serve his purposes or validate his importance. Somewhere in those lights, Arthur Hale was beginning the work of rebuilding what Richard had damaged, restoring values that Richard had dismissed as obstacles to efficiency and profit extraction. Somewhere in the darkness between lights, homeless people were settling into doorways and under bridges, experiencing the vulnerability that Richard had briefly witnessed that morning, before his comfortable assumptions about power and permanence had been demolished by the revelation that the man he'd humiliated controlled everything Richard thought he'd built. The city held all of it simultaneously, triumph and failure, compassion and cruelty, the endless human drama of people trying to survive and find meaning in systems that rewarded some and destroyed others, with mechanisms that seemed increasingly arbitrary the more closely you examined them. Richard picked up his cardboard box, feeling its weight one final time before walking out into the Dallas night. No longer a billionaire CEO, but just another person carrying belongings and searching for what came next, when everything you'd built revealed itself as temporary and contingent and constructed on foundations that couldn't support the weight of your illusions about who you were and what you'd actually accomplished in the brief time you'd held power over others who'd pretended to respect you while waiting for the moment when your authority would inevitably crumble and reveal the frightened, uncertain human beneath the performance of invincibility.